Fulfilled prophecy. We should become aware of those prophetic details that have not been fulfilled, so we can be alert to how they may correlate with what is happening in the world today. Here's Gene to explain.
As we move into this section of Daniel, you'll find that the first 6 chapters basically are historical. We've looked at those historical developments. It covers a long period of time, from the time Daniel was 15 years old till he was in his early 80s when he went into the lion's den. And a lot of people don't realize, because pictures of Daniel in the lion's den frequently have him just as a young person, but he was indeed somewhere between 83 and 85 at the point where he was thrown into that den of lions. Now, when you get to chapter 7, you move into what is both historical and prophetic in a very unique way. That doesn't mean there aren't prophetic sections in the first 6 chapters, but the focus now is prophecy. But the interesting thing is that in chapter 7, chapter 8, and going back, you actually see these things being fulfilled and experienced by Daniel earlier on in events that took place prior to this moment in his life. So here's a timeline, I think, that might help you. The chapters in Daniel 7 and 8, and we're moving into 7 and 8 in this particular principle. Daniel now is in his mid-60s, so that takes us back to the beginning of Belshazzar's reign. Remember that he was the one that pronounced judgment on Belshazzar at the end of his reign when he was in his 80s, so it's going to go back about 20 years. And then we have chapter 9, and chapter 9, he's in his early 80s when we see this particular prophetic situation. And then chapters 10 to 12, again, he is at this time in his mid-80s, towards the end of his chronological life as we know it. So let's move into this with what we call Daniel's visions. And we see this in verses 1 to 3. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Now again, we've talked about Belshazzar. He was the one who saw the handwriting on the wall. That takes us back about 20 years as far as when it actually happened in Daniel's life. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream with visions in his mind. As he was lying in his bed, he wrote down the dream, and here is the summary of his account. Daniel said, "In my vision, at night I was watching, and suddenly the 4 winds of heaven stirred up the great sea. 4 huge beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other." So he'll give the account of these 4 beasts. We'll go back and take a look at them specifically. But as he continues to unfold the story, we see what we call a reference to King of Kings and Lord of Lords, another kingdom. And notice what he says, "I continued watching in the night visions, and I saw one, capital O, like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven." Sounds like what Jesus wrote in Matthew in his prophecies. "He approached the Ancient of Days," and that's God the Father, "and was escorted before him. He was given authority to rule in glory and a kingdom, so that those of every people, nation, language should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed." Now here is the summary of the interpretation. We find that in verses 17 and 18. "These huge beasts, 4 in number, are 4 kings." Now remember that he ends up with another king who is King of Kings, not these 4 kings. "These huge beasts, 4 in number, are 4 kings who will rise from the earth, but the holy ones of the Most High will receive the kingdom," that is, all believers, "and possess it forever," yes, forever and ever, and of course, Our king will be King of Kings and Lord of Lords, as we read in that beautiful passage in the book of Revelation. Now, what I want to do is to take you back and show you the incredible correlation of these visions with other events within the book of Daniel. I'm going to take you back to chapter 2. And chapter 2 is where Daniel, at age 17, actually revealed the dream and interpreted it. And what he saw and what Nebuchadnezzar saw in that dream, way back in chapter 2, was a head of gold in this huge statue, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of clay. And then at the end of that, we actually see that a great rock came out of the earth and actually crushed the feet of clay. And it's very clear that that is a reference to King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Jesus Christ. What we have here is an interesting correlation that you're going to see in chapter 7 and 8. Because here, basically, projecting ahead, here's what we know about what this actually meant, what this dream meant into the future. Because Daniel actually said in chapter 2 that he said, Nebuchadnezzar, what you've seen is what God plans for the future. That's what he told him way back in chapter 2, 17 years old. And here is, in essence, the interpretation, but we have to fill in some lines and some data because not all of this happened in terms of what Daniel said back there in chapter 2. So, here is the kingdoms that are referenced. We have the head of gold, and Daniel actually said to Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold, but that's symbolic of the Babylonian Empire. He was over the Babylonian Empire. The chest and arms of silver, Medo-Persia, that conquered Babylon. The belly and thighs of bronze is Greece, that conquered Medo-Persia. And then the legs of iron and feet of clay obviously have to be Rome, the Roman Empire. And this would be the chronology of these major empires that actually were revealed to Nebuchadnezzar in this statue, which Daniel then interpreted. Now, when we come into chapter 7, you're going to see the correlation. Here in chapter 7, note, what he saw in the dream is a lion, which correlates with the head of gold, or Babylonia. We see a bear, which correlates with the chest and arms of silver, which is Medo-Persia. We see the leopard, which correlates with the belly and thighs of bronze, which is Greece. We see this terrifying and frightening beast, which is not named. I think of a Jurassic Park type of beast, which obviously represents the Roman Empire. But it also, as we'll see, has a double meaning. Now, I'd like to take you back to those four beasts. And first of all, what you see with the lion, he has eagle's wings. And those eagle's wings in that vision are torn off. And that represents the time when Nebuchadnezzar lost his mind. And then he was restored. And we see that actually illustrated in that vision of the lion. The bear had 3 ribs in its mouth. The 3 ribs really probably represent Cyrus' capture of 3 major areas. The bear. And the bear's tilted, representing Medo-Persia, and Persia is the higher one because it was Persia that took over the Media Empire. Then you have the leopard, and the leopard has 4 wings of a bird and 4 heads, and it's really clear from history this represents Alexander the Great. And those 4 heads actually literally came into existence after Alexander the Great was killed. And there were 4 kingdoms that emerged out of the Grecian Empire. This is all what Daniel saw in this dream with these 4 great beasts. And then you have this terrifying beast which has 10 horns on its head and has teeth that crush. It has incredibly great power. So you see the correlation then in chapter 7 with what Daniel saw in revealing that dream in chapter 2. Now, when we go to chapter 8, we have a more specific, detailed description of 2 additional animals which correlate. You have a ram. And as you look at the ram, that ram is now on the same, it's the same meaning as the bear, which represents the chest-armed silver in Medo-Persia. Then you see a he-goat. And that he-goat is on the same level as the leopard, representing the Grecian Empire. Now, I want to give you a little more specificity in relationship to the ram and the goat and what Daniel actually saw. When he saw the ram had 2 horns, but it says clearly that this beast, this ram, was charging. And he says that he charged to the west, he charged to the north, he charged to the south, but not to the east. And that's exactly what Cyrus did. He went to the west, the north, and the south, and he conquered everyone. And that represents, obviously, the Medo-Persian Empire and correlates with the bear. And then you have the male goat. And the male goat is going across the earth, not touching the ground. And that correlates with the speed of the leopard. And that represents, obviously, Alexander the Great and the speed with which he conquered the Medo-Persian Empire. And then he saw this happening. This he-goat crashed in to the ram and destroyed the ram. And that's exactly what happened when Alexander the Great attacked the Medo-Persian Empire. And this is all interpreted, obviously, and by the way, it's at this point, if we go back to that overall graphic, that we see for the very first time the enumeration of these kingdoms. We know the Babylonian Empire because Daniel lived at that time. When he prophesied to the future, but it existed. We also know that as he was in his 60s, he's now in the Medo-Persian Empire with Belshazzar. And so he understood that, but he had no concept of Greece. He had no concept of Rome. And yet, in chapter 8, the Medo-Persian Empire and Greece are named, and Greece is named before it ever came into existence. God gave him that information. So what we have here is an incredible picture of history. And it leads us to a very important question for response and reflection, and that is, though we're to be alert as to how prophecy is being fulfilled today, why must we be cautious in interpreting and promoting specific current events as being what Daniel foresaw centuries ago? And the interesting thing is, when you look at the Roman Empire, as is described there is going to be, obviously, a renewed Roman Empire, occupying the same area because things are described there in Daniel that never happened to the destruction of the Roman Empire. It was gradual, but what you see in Daniel, it's sudden. The destruction that's going to come on the Roman Empire under the leadership of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Now, the interesting thing is that when the common market came into existence in Europe, the European Economic Community, it came in, first of all, the Treaty of Rome in 1957. There were 6 nations that formed this union. Then later there were 3. That brought it to 9. Then, would you believe, it came to 10. Greece was the last one. And everybody said, that's it. Until Here comes Spain and Portugal, takes it to 12. And now it increases beyond that. What I'm simply saying is that we've got to be very careful how we interpret prophecy. This leads to the principle, which I think is a very important principle. Though we should become aware of those prophetic details that have not been fulfilled, so we can be alert to how they may correlate with what is happening in the world today. Yes, we're to study prophecy, but always with caution, because I believe that God purposely wants to keep us wondering what's going to happen next. He gives us a general outline, but he wants us to live really in the view of the fact that he could come at any moment. But at the same time, we're to be about our Father's business, as if he would not come for another 1,000 years. We're to be ready, but always involved in the Father's business.